الله أكبر أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن لا إله إلا الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله أشهد أن محمدًا رسول الله حي على الصلاة حي على الصلاة حي على الفلاح حي على الفلاح الله أكبر الله أكبر لا إله إلا الله
إن الحمد لله نحمده ونستعينه ونستغفره ونعوذ بالله تعالى من شرور أنفسنا ومن سيئات أعمالنا من يهدي الله فهو المهتد ومن يضلل فلن تجد له وليا مرشدا ونشهد أن لا إله إلا الله وحده لا شريك له له الملك وله الحمد وهو على كل شيء قدير ونشهد أن محمدا عبده ورسوله وصفيه وخليله أدى الأمانة وبلغ الرسالة ونصح الأمة وكشف الله به الغمة وجاهد في الله حق جهاده حتى أتاه الله اليقين فصلوات الله عليه وعلى آله وأصحابه ومن اتبعهم بإحسان إلى يوم الدين ثم أما بعد فإن أصدق الحديث كتاب الله وخير الهدي هدي محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وشر الأمور محدثاتها وكل محدثة بدعة وكل بدعة ضلالة وكل ضلالة في النار اللهم أجرنا من النار اللهم حرم وجوهنا ووجوه والدينا من النار قال الله تعالى يا أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة وخلق منها زوجها وبث منهما رجالا كثيرا ونساء واتقوا الله الذي تساءلون به والأرحام إن الله كان عليكم رقيبا ويقول تعالى يا أيها الذين آمنوا اتقوا الله حق تقاته ولا تموتن إلا وأنتم مسلمون. My dear respected brothers, sisters and elders, we begin with praising Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in a manner that is only befitting to Him, in a manner that has been taught to us through His Messenger Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam. We praise Him and we thank Him. We beseech His guidance and we ask for His forgiveness, because whomsoever Allah guides, then he is truly guided, and whomsoever Allah chooses to lead astray, then no one can guide him. And we bear witness that there is no deity worthy of worship but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is the one omnipotent God. He has the power to do all things, and His dominion stretches through the heavens and the earth, and to Him we shall return. And we bear witness that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wa sallam is a slave and final messenger. He delivered to us the absolute perfect message. Through that message, He was able to take mankind out of the darkness of ignorance into the light of Iman. He was able to take mankind out of heedlessness into full consciousness of their duties to their Lord. So may the peace and blessings be upon Him, His family, and the companions, and whosoever follows until the day of resurrection. We remind ourselves in this weekly reminder to fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, to let our thoughts, that is this going to please our Creator, we let that dictate our every action in our daily lives. Is this going to please my Creator, or is this going to displease Him? If it pleases Him, then we enjoy in that good. And if it displeases Him, then we forbid that evil. To a point that when the angel of death comes and takes our souls, we're in a state of absolute submission to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And we recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us to enjoin in what is good, and forbid what is evil, and to call what is good. And then, on top of all this, have patience on that. So once we do it, and we see the people doing it, now we have patience until Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to take us out of this life. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given the trial of patience for the believers. The ultimate test for the believer is the patience. He has attained the faith. He knows what is good and he knows what is wrong. So now, all he has to do is be patient on that. He has to enjoy what is good and keep on that. And the Prophet ﷺ makes us sure that we have to stay patient on this. He warned us that a time will come that holding on to our religion will be so difficult. He compared it to, he said, الْقَابِدُ عَلَى دِينِهِ كَالْقَابِدُ عَلى جَمْرَةٍ مِنَ النَّارِ. The one holding on to his religion will be like the one holding on to a piece of hot coal. He tries to hold on to his religion, but it's telling him to let go. The things around him are telling him to let go. He's trying to follow every command of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but he can't do it. The things around him are making him let go. But that person tries to stay patient, and he stays on that. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us why we might be afflicted with these trials and tribulations. It's for Him to distinguish between us. He tells us, وَلَنَبْلُوَنَّكُمْ حَتَّى نَعْلَمَ الْمُجَاهِدِينَ مِنْكُمْ وَالصَّابِرِينَ وَنَبْلُوَ أَخْبَارَكُمْ. And we will try you. We'll put you through trials and tribulations in order for us to know who is willing to struggle in our path. Who is willing to struggle for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And who is going to be patient on it. And He tells us, and then He will appraise our deeds. If we've done good, then we will earn a certain reward for those good deeds. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guarantees us that He will send trials and tribulations for the believers. Not just for the non-believers. For the believers, even the believers may be more. He will send them trials and tribulations in order so we can see who really is the one that's going to struggle for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Who really has attained the best attribute of patience. So, what's the reward for being amongst the patient ones? Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells His believing servants, He tells us, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا اتَّقُوا رَبَّكُمْ لِلَّذِينَ أَحْسَنُوا فِي هَذِهِ الدُّنْيَا حَسَنَةٌ وَأَرْضُ اللَّهِ وَاسِعَةٌ إِنَّمَا يُوَفَّى الصَّابِرُونَ أَجْرَهُمْ بِغَيْرِ حِسَابٍ. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, my believing servants, but my servants that have attained faith, fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Be conscious of your duties to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For those who have done good, then they earn good. For the reward for the good is good. Those who do good in this life, then they earn good in the hereafter. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us in His book, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and His land is huge. It spans from the east to the west. So if we cannot do good in a certain land, if we cannot do good in this land, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given us the option to travel to whatever land that we can do good in. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues on telling us that the ones that have attained patience, then they receive their reward without any measure. The people that have attained the attribute of patience in this life, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward them with a reward that we cannot even measure. That's the promise that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised to His servants. But how do we earn this reward? Through patience. That is the ultimate test for the believer in this life. The Prophet ﷺ informs us of what kind of patience there is. There's not only one type of patience, but there's patience in 3 occasions. The Prophet ﷺ told us the first kind of patience is in worshipping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following His commands. The second type of patience is in abstaining from the wrong actions, from the things that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden us from doing. And the third type of patience is in accepting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the decree of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and accepting the decree. So many of us think that patience is just the first form. That when something happens, that person is supposed to show patience on not making kufr against Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But keeping up with the salah, keeping up with your actions is a patience itself. And these types of patience are confirmed in Surah Luqman. When Luqman alayhi salam is telling his son, a wise man telling his son, the best advice that a father can give his son. He tells him, يَا بُنَيَّ أَقِمِ الصَّلَاةَ وَأْمُرْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ وَانْهَى عَنِ الْمُنكَرِ وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا أَصَابَكَ إِنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ He tells him, oh my son, establish prayer. Don't just pray, establish it. So call for prayer. And then enjoin what is good and forbid what is evil. So that's the second type of patience. And then وَاصْبِرْ عَلَى مَا أَصَابَكَ And have patience with what afflicts you. So that is the third type of patience. What better advice can be from a father, a wise father, to his son? So these three types of patience are confirmed through that. And then he tells us that إِنَّ ذَلِكَ مِنْ عَزْمِ الْأُمُورِ And that is the best of actions. That is one of the best things that you could do. So first, we'll talk about the first type of patience. And the third type of patience, in accepting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's decree. Some of us might see this as the hardest one. But if we truly look at it, we'll see that it's actually one of the easiest ones. Because we can see it happening. Right away. If something happens to us, a calamity afflicts us, we know that this is happening. So right away we can hold ourselves from doing things that we should not be doing. Ibn Qayyim tells us what having patience in these times is. He tells us in times of grief, we stop ourselves from despairing. We stop our tongues from complaining. We stop our hands from hitting our faces and tearing our clothes. In times of grief, patience is stopping ourselves from feeling that the situation is hopeless, feeling that there's no way out. So if we have faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we have attained patience, then we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take us out of that situation. That situation is only temporary. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will always protect us from long-lasting danger. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala even tells us, وَمَن يَتَّقِ اللَّهِ يَجْعَلْ لَهُ مَخْرَجًا And whoever fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and is conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, Allah will take him out of it. He'll provide a means of leaving that situation. That is the belief that we should have. So nothing should make us despair from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We always know that if this happens to us, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will take us out from it. And we all know the story of the woman that the Prophet ﷺ passed after her son had just passed away. And she's crying and yelling. And the Prophet ﷺ goes to counsel her and tells her, be the patient ones. And she does not know that is the Prophet ﷺ. And she tells him, what do you know? Leave me alone. So the Prophet ﷺ stays calm and leaves her. And then later on she's informed that was the Prophet ﷺ. So she runs to him and tells him, I am among the patient ones. But the Prophet ﷺ says, no. Patience is at the time of the calamity. That's when we show the true patience. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us why we should have patience at those times. Why we shouldn't despair. He tells us in the Quran, he says, فَاصْبِرْ صَبْرًا جَمِيلًا إِنَّهُمْ يَرَوْنَهُ بَعِيدًا وَنَرَاهُ قَرِيبًا Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, have a patience that's beautiful. A beautiful patience. For they see as far away. They see the judgment as far away, but we see as close. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala could decide to take our souls at any time. We know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only testing us in this life in order so we could gain ranks in the hereafter. So we know to have patience in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in order so we could increase our level in paradise. And when Prophet Yaqub alayhi salam was informed of Yusuf alayhi salam supposedly dying, what did he say? He says, I only complain to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For complaining to others can nullify our patience. If many of us go and complain to this person and this person, hoping to get some sympathy. Hoping this person will say, oh no, you don't deserve this. No, you're a good person. This shouldn't have happened. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who decides who gets tested with this trial and tribulation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who decides who's good. So complaining should only be to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, not to the people. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, He tells us ما أصاب من مصيبة إلا بإذن الله ومن يؤمن بالله يهدي قلبه والله بكل شيء عليم. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, and everything that happens, there's not one thing that happens that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not know about. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows about every single thing that happens. And then He tells us, and whomsoever believes, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will allow guidance for his heart. He will allow for tranquility inside his heart. The believers know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just testing them. So their hearts stay tranquil at the time of the affliction. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala continues on telling us that He knows everything. He knows everything that happens. So don't think that you're lost. When something happens to you, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the one who decided that this will happen to you. So then the second type of patience, and abstaining from the wrong actions. I don't think I need to give you many examples of what happens in the city. When we drive, what we see. When we try to do good, what we see. And we always try to hold ourselves back. A wise young man once said that I am highly inflammable. By nature, I am highly inflammable. And then I'm already inflammable, and what they do is they send sparks on me. And then not only do they send sparks, they throw entire bombs at me. So by nature, man wants to do what is wrong, wants to follow his desires. And then nature around him is sending sparks on him. Do this thing, do that thing. And then some people may succumb to this, but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala always wants us to turn back to Him. So what abstaining was from wrong. That is one of the types of patience. And that's, for many people, that is one of the harder ones. To stay away from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbade. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us why we shouldn't follow these desires. He tells us that these things are only temporary. He tells us in the book, He tells us, مَا عِنْدَكُمْ يَنْفُدُ وَمَا عِنْدَ اللَّهِ بَاقٍ وَلَنَجْزِيَنَّ الَّذِينَ صَبَرُوا أَجْرَهُمْ بِأَحْسَنِ مَا كَانُوا يَعْمَلُونَ. He tells us, whatever you have is only temporary. It will diminish. But whatever Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has, whatever reward Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has ready for you, then that lasts forever. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, the ones that have patience, the ones that showed patience in this life, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will reward them with the best of what they used to do. So, as a human being, of course, that person is going to slip up. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows that this person enjoying what is good most of the time, so He will reward him with the best that he used to do. He will overlook the bad things that he used to do, and the reward will be for the best things that he used to do. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reminds us how we can have this patience. With who do we have this patience from? He tells us, وَاصْبُرْ وَمَا صَبْرُكَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ وَلَا تَحْزَنْ عَلَيْهِمْ وَلَا تَكُنْ فِي ضَيْقٍ مِّمَّا يَمْكُرُونَ. And have patience. And your patience is with no one but with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And do not grieve for what they do. Do not want to do what they do. Do not look at what the kuffar do and say, oh, I wish I was doing this. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be patient from these things. So do not grieve what these people do. Even your family members. If you see a family member of yours doing this and this, know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the only one that can guide. So you have patience with your family members and you don't lose hope with them either. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, but even if we slip, even if we lose this type of patience, the second type of patience is in abstaining from what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has forbidden. He reminds us to turn back to Him. He wants us to always turn back to Him, for He forgives everything. He tells us in His book, He tells us, قُلْ يَا عِبَادِيَ الَّذِينَ أَسْرَفُوا عَلَىٰ أَنفُسِهِمْ لَا تَقْنَطُوا مِنْ رَحْمَةِ اللَّهِ إِنَّ اللَّهَ يَغْفِرُ الذُّنُوبَ جَمِيعًا إِنَّهُ هُوَ الْغَفُورُ الرَّحِيمُ. He says, O my servants, He says, say, O my servants, who have spent extravagantly against their own souls. They've oppressed their own soul. He tells them, do not despair from the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala forgives all things that we make tawbah for. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the most forgiving and the most merciful. So even if we have slipped, then we turn to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, for He is the most merciful to His servants. And then in a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ tells us the reward of being patient. Why Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala chooses to afflict us with a trial or tribulation. How this trial or tribulation really benefits us. He tells us, مَا مِن مُسْلِمٍ بشوكة فما فوقها إلا كتب له بها درجات ومحيت عنها بها خطايا. The Prophet ﷺ tells us that a Muslim that does not get pricked with a thorn except that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes for him a good deed, and on top of this, He wipes out a bad deed. So He tells us, for even if a Muslim gets pricked with a thorn, and then He tells us, and whatever above that too. So any trial or tribulation or any pain, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala writes for him a good deed, and then He wipes away one bad deed. That is, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala truly is the most merciful. We might despair from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at times. But if we recognize that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only trying to alleviate our degrees in Jannah, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will recognize that we should worship no one but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now the first type of patience, in worshiping Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and following His commands. Many people, the people that attend Salat al-Jum'ah, they know that we should worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We've already attained the faith, alhamdulillah, inshallah. We already know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is our God. And we already know that Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam is His messenger. We already know the commands that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has commanded us through His messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But now, are we patient on doing those actions? Are we patient in doing good at any time, not just when it favors us? For Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us in the Quran, لا يسأم الإنسان من دعاء الخير وإن مسه الشر فيئوس قنوط. The person does not get tired from calling on good when everything's good. But then if something bad happens to him, then he is despairing. He loses all hope. But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to have patience, to worship Him at every single time. We might be doing this, but right when we stop what we're doing and we go to our prayers. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that one of the signs of patience is the one that keeps up with His prayers. He tells us, وَأْمُرْ أَهْلَكَ بِالصَّلَاةِ وَاصْطَبِرْ عَلَيْهَا لَا نَسْأَلُكَ رِزْقًا نَحْنُ نَرْزُقُكَ وَالْعَاقِبَةُ لِلتَّقْوَى. He tells us, and call upon prayer. Establish prayer with your family. So command them to pray. Do not worry about sustenance. We will provide you with sustenance. And the end is for those who have taqwa, those who fear Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So have patience for your salah. That is one of the things that earns you patience as well. So it is showing patience in itself to pray, and then through prayer we earn patience. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us who we should have patience with, who we should be patient with. How could we build up our patience? He tells us that in one of the surahs, He tells us, وَاصْبِرْ مَعَ الَّذِينَ يَدْعُونَ رَبَّهُمْ بِالْغَدَاةِ وَالْعَشِيِّ يُرِيدُونَ وَجْهَهُ. He tells us, and have patience with those who call upon their Lord in the night and in the evening and in the morning, the ones that want to see His most glorified face. The ones that want to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Jannah. Those are the ones that we should have patience with. Those are the brothers that attend the Masjid regularly. For the Masjid is open for every single prayer. So we should try to attend every single prayer. And then, also in the story of Yusuf alayhi salam, after he reveals to his brothers that he is their brother, he is Yusuf alayhi salam. And we know all the things that Yusuf alayhi salam went through. And then he tells us how he was able to have this patience. How Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala allowed him to have this patience. He says in the end of one of the ayahs, He tells us, إِنَّهُ مَنْ يَتَّقِي وَيَصْبِرْ فَإِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُضِيعُ أَجْرَ الْمُحْسِنِينَ. Whomsoever has patience and fears Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and is conscious that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is just testing him, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not lose the deeds of those who do good. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala wants us to be patient. He is just trying to alleviate our degrees in Jannah, and may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make us among the patient ones and practice what we say and what we hear. أقول قولي هذا وأستغفر الله لي ولكم. الله تبارك وتعالى. الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. إن الله وملائكته يصلون على النبي يا أيها الذين آمنوا صلوا عليه وسلموا تسليما. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما صليت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم وبارك على محمد وعلى آل محمد كما باركت على إبراهيم وعلى آل إبراهيم إنك حميد مجيد. وأطيعوا الله ورسوله ولا تنزعوا فتفشلوا وتذهب ريحكم واصبروا إن الله مع الصابرين. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, and follow Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, follow the commands of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, submit to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and follow the commands of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And do not despair from this, because if you despair from this, then you will fail. You will fail in this life. And then your actions will be shown to the people. And then he tells us, وَاصْبِرُوا إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. And then have patience, for Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is with those who have patience. So if we want Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to guide us in every action in our life, then we have to try to have these attributes of patience. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He knows that the person is created impatient. He tells us, إِنَّ الْإِنسَانَ خُلِقَ هَلُوعًا. He tells us the man is created impatient. He wants to do this, and if something stops him or goes in his way, he will become impatient. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is the creator. Who knows the creation better than the creator? But Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us why He might afflict us with this thing. For we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala just wants us to earn the highest degree that we can in Jannah. He tells us, in a hadith, the Prophet ﷺ tells us that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala might want a certain rank for His servants. He might have a certain rank for His servant prepared for him already. But the servant cannot earn this rank with only his actions. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala afflicts him with what this person might hate to test him with patience. And this patience keeps on earning him higher and higher degrees until he attains the strength that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has prepared for him. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is only trying to build up our ranks in Jannah. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us that He knows that there's people that do not naturally have patience. I see with the Sunday school kids. Some of the kids, you'll see them just sitting, patient, not asking anything, and then you'll see some of the kids, I'll be in the middle of talking about something, about we're learning or something. And you'll see one of the little kids just raise his hand randomly, Brother Deyaa, when are we having pizza? Just random like that. They don't have any patience. But then you'll see some of the kids, wow, the food is being handed out, they're sitting patiently. So there's people that naturally have patience, and some people do not have this natural patience. And but Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, وَمَنْ يَتَصَبَّرْ يُصَبِّرْهُ اللَّهُ. And whoever tries to show that he has patience, tries to earn this attribute of patience, then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will ingrain this patience in him. He will be able to build up the patience if he tries to have these attributes. We're also told, if a person does not naturally possess the characteristics of patience, he can attain it by acting like he has those characteristics until they become second nature. So we act on it until it becomes second nature for us. Then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us, just to conclude, He tells us what these people that have the patience at the time of calamity earn. He tells us to call to these people, to tell them what they have earned. He tells us, وَبَشِّرِ الصَّابِرِينَ الَّذِينَ إِذَا أَصَابَتْهُمْ مُصِيبَةٌ قَالُوا إِنَّا لِلَّهِ وَإِنَّا إِلَيْهِ رَاجِعُونَ. And give glad tidings to the patient ones. The ones that when something happens to them, when a trial or tribulation happens to them, the only thing they say is, we belong to Allah and to Allah we shall return. اللهم اجعلنا منهم. اللهم اجعلنا من الصابرين. ربنا آتنا في الدنيا حسنة وفي الآخرة حسنة وقنا عذاب النار. اللهم اهدنا واهد بنا واجعلنا سببا لمن اهتدى. اللهم انصر الإسلام والمسلمين ودمر أعداء الدين. اللهم إنا نسألك رضاك والجنة ونعوذ بك من سخطك والنار. اللهم إنك عفو تحب العفو فاعف عنا. اللهم اغفر للمؤمنين والمؤمنات المسلمين والمسلمات الأحياء منهم والأموات إنك سميع قريب مجيب الدعوات. وصلى الله على سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وأصحابه والتابعين. أقم الصلاة والصلاة تنهى عن الفحشاء والمنكر.